Thanks a lot for tuning into this YouTube channel. This is your co-host, Saim Sabdur, for Cloud Native Podcasts. We will be exploring today Gitpod. And let me give you some center stage for today's conversation. So Gitpod is an open source platform for automated and ready to code development environments that blend into your existing workflow. It gives us an IDE to write code, all the tools we need to compile our applications, run test, and do whatever else we might be doing. It eliminates the configuration drift and ensure every developer is always working on the latest configuration. And it gives us the infrastructure we need. It allow us to onboard anyone into any project instantly. So let me go to my guest, Lou Bichard, from or in itself to speak about this technology and this tool. So thank you very much for joining us again on this YouTube channel. Lou, it's been pleasure talking to you once more time. Your kick intro and then we kickstart the proceeding.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sam. The second time I'm back now, I think. Second time, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
no, super excited. Nice little intro of Gitpod, and we'll dive into it and talk a bit, I'm sure, about sort of the background, why people are using Gitpod, and yeah, maybe the future of cloud development environments and CDEs as well.
Yes, absolutely. So without any further delay, let's speak about the motivation behind Gitpod. What gave us an idea and how this actually journey begins?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's one. So I've been working now for Gitpod for just over 2 years, and it's a story actually I only got told maybe a year or so into the life of Gitpod, and it was actually great to hear it. It was quite interesting to hear the sort of the origin story. So Gitpod as a company is born from a separate company, or the founders were basically working, sort of doing sort of developer tooling consulting in Germany for lots of different German companies, and they were doing lots of stuff about languages and editors and this kind of thing. And at some point, I'm not sure if it was a contracted gig or if it was them themselves, but this sort of idea came to them at some point, to the founders of Gitpod, especially around pull requests. And the question really was like, how do I, it's kind of frustrating when you go to a different pull request when you're working on open source, and they were working on a lot of open source at the time. But when you go to, sort of check out someone else's pull request, is you have to then change all your environment, right? So if they're using a different node version or a different version of Terraform or running on some different package, you have to change all of that just to review the pull request. And probably for a lot of people watching, they'll just skip that step. And think, it's not worth it. So they started to think at that point, really, like, what would it look like? What would the world look like if I could go to any pull request or any code, really, be able to press a button or run a command and essentially have your machine, your laptop set up and ready to code? And that mantra of ready to code actually is carried forward even today. And we talk about this a lot because one of the main purposes of Gitpod is really to get developers ready to code. And by ready to code, what we mean is reducing the time between, having an idea or going to a pull request or starting a new project, and having the time between that moment appearing to you and being ready to actually fingers on your keyboard, writing code in your editor, to be zero. And that's really where the idea came from. So the founders sort of set about creating that as a sort of a proof of concept, and we'll do a bit of a demo later. And the initial inception really was just a simple way. So, you go to a pull request, you press a button, and what that did is then it provisioned under the hood a workspace for you in the cloud. And, then you could just hop in there and it would check out your code. And then naturally, then other questions came up. Okay, well, what if I installed things in here? And this sort of story progresses on from this sort of simple idea to where we are today, which is really taking that idea of ready to code and really taking it also to a lot more context than just a pull request, a lot more context than just open source, but actually taking this really to any and every company that exists in the world. And we really do believe that this will be the new norm eventually, is this norm around cloud development environment, standard workstations, so that we just don't have this sort of like works on my machine problem anymore. We just don't talk about that, because ideally we have that entirely solved. And that's kind of the vision of Gitpod itself. And we learn every day as well, even from our customers, the way that they sort of approach and come to Gitpod, and new ideas and frontiers I think have come about, because really what we're doing here is kind of flipping a narrative that's kind of, has existed for a long time, which is, us working on our devices now. Of course, if I go on Twitter, someone will tell me about the time when we used to code on a mainframe, but to a degree, it's kind of like, yeah, kind of. If you take that idea of coding on a mainframe and bring it to today's world and add sort of modern tools and aspects to it, and there's elements of that as well. But it's as you know, the tech world sort of pendulum swings side to side, but in a way that we're making sort of forward progress as well. So it might look the
Yes.
same as things we've done in the past, but it's not the same. It's very different, I think.
Absolutely, totally agree with you. And basically, I think I really like the thinking behind it, because if you look at the one number of open source projects and number of the maintainer of those open source project, they're quite over a million of there. And sometimes you have a click an idea, and instantly you have click an idea, then you start making a pull request, and then you end up realizing I need to do refactoring of certain things, and then you need to bring up your laptop, and then you pre-configure all those environment that's currently not in your system, and then eventually idea goes, because you are actually end up sprawling with the dependencies that tooling need in order to get your idea in the form of pull request. So this idea is really generic one. Basically, you come up with an idea. Instead of writing and configuring your npm packages, what application actually needed dependency to run on my machine, why not we have a browser that give us the essential tooling and all the pre-configured libraries, and then you click on a button, submit a pull request, verify it, test it out without even touching your local files and directories. That's a very great idea, because sometime I notice some individuals wanted to contribute, but the laptop they're working on is actually a restricted environment. They can't add stuff into it, they can't remove stuff to it, because this is basically their company's owned laptop. So Gitbot is actually remove the hurdle of these little details that makes very huge difference, huge impact. So now you have a one button in your Git repository. Click on it, work on something, make a pull request, or if you're a reviewer of that pull request, click a button, review it out, test it up, and deploy it. That's a super idea. So I now wanted Lou Booker to give us some tour how things actually work, how things set it up, and if people want to go into the Gitpod website, how they actually want to interact with it. So over to you, if Lou, if you want to give us some tour.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sharing my screen, so if you want to sort of make that available, then I can give you a quick.
Yes, I'm actually adding this now on the stage. Your screen is now visible.
Awesome. Very cool. So what I'll do, Sam, is I'll give you a quick demo of two, maybe three things. So one is I'll just quickly show you that pull request flow we talked about at the start. And I'll show you how that opens up. Actually, you can open that in a browser tab. So we get into the sort of coding environment in your browser, which is a very popular integration that we have in Gitpod. But then after that, I actually do want to show you how you can also do the same thing also from your CLI, launching also VS Code on your device, because that's something that often gets missed. Is, sometimes we do these demos and we show the coding in the browser, and then people think that that's the only aspect of Gitpod. So I really want to show you also the CLI flow there as well, because it just shows you some of the elements of flexibility of this type of tool. So yeah, let's go ahead and jump in. I'll actually go into a repo. So imagine this is you. So this could be a repository you're working on.
Are you sharing? Low, sorry for it. So, are you sharing your Git repo, or are you in the wrong tab? I guess.
You should see. Hold on. Yes. Let me try again. Maybe I'm presenting the wrong screen. I want to do. Let me do my entire screen. So you should see GitHub now, hopefully.
Absolutely, 100%. I can see it.
Awesome. Awesome. So you're in your repository in GitHub, and this could be in Bitbucket or in GitLab as well. we're a different SCM provider, but I'll show you in GitHub. And let's say you've gone into your repository and you're, in this case, maybe you're starting your day and you're actually going to go in and review some code that other people have worked on. So I'm going to go ahead in here and open up a pull request. This one's been raised by Sean. Let's say I want to go and check that out. And that could be me as a developer. It could be could actually be anyone on your team who might want to interface with that. If that's quality assurance, a product manager wants to see how work is progressing, or in an open source context, someone just checking out some feature that's being added. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go over here and click on this Gitpod button. Now, of course, this doesn't actually exist in the GitHub interface. That's added by a browser extension that we add, that you can add to your browser, basically, so you can go straight into Gitpod. What that does is that then puts your repository into the URL, which you can do yourself as well if you want to manually add gitpod.io/hash and then the full repository. So you can come straight from a URL as well. And that takes you into Gitpod. Then what this is doing is it's going to create you a workspace, which in simple terms, you can think about as having, it's a copy of your laptop or a computer that's then running in the cloud. So I've got a couple of options. Here is the context in which I'm coding. In this case, it's this pull request. I get some choices here for different editors. So I'll show you quickly the browser, and we'll also show on desktop in a second. You've got some different choices here for different JetBrains IDs as well. You can even code directly in the terminal in your browser, which is very similar to what you see also in a lot of cloud providers as well. Pick my resource allocation, how many CPUs, how much memory do I want, and then go ahead, click continue, and that's going to start essentially spinning me up that workspace so I can jump in there and get coding. So whilst that is spinning up over there, I will quickly also show you what this looks like when you come from the command line as well. So this CLI is actually, this is an early thing for you, Simon. So special demo for today. So this is actually in private beta right now, but it will be released next week, essentially.
Oh, wow.
But I'm going to show you that today, which is a CLI. So we also have a Gitpod CLI, which basically allows you to do what's called workspace management, which is managing these workspaces that you have in the cloud. Once you move your work to the cloud, you can have as many workspaces as you want. If you want 10 of them, if you want to multitask, work on this pull request right now and this other piece of code, you can. So let me go ahead and show you how that works. So if I go ahead in here and go Gitpod workspace list, what I basically will see is my different workspaces. So you can basically think of this as like having as many laptops as you need that are running for each different task that you're working on. And I like to think of workspaces actually kind of like to-do tasks almost, because you can have a workspace up and running whilst you're working on something. Then once it's done, then you can throw that workspace away and kind of get on with some other work. But for as long as you're working on it, then you've got that piece of state, you've got that state of your machine that you can always hop back into. So especially if you're a prolific open sourcer, firing out pull requests on different repositories or inside your company, if you're helping out lots of your team, you can keep all of those running at the same time, which is great. So what I'm going to do in here as well is actually just going to create a new workspace. Again, I'm going to use that same repository in this case, but this time I'm going to actually manually specify as well. I'm going to override my preference, and I want to open this using VS Code Desktop. So I'm also going to get that running. That's going to start me a new workspace. So we started one in the browser. I've also started one here in the CLI. Now, if I go back to my browser, we'll have a look at this, and then we'll come back to VS Code as well. So here we have essentially VS Code running in your browser. This is running that repository we just looked at, and it's actually already installed and ran through absolutely everything already. So if it's just pulling me back to VS Code because I told it I wanted to open that, but we'll have a look at that in just a sec. And if I go in here and I open this here, we have a file here called a Gitpod YAML. And this is Gitpod YAML is essentially your sort of declarative file that's saying, when you start this repository, what should you do? Like, what do I need to be installed? What do I need to be running in order to start my work? So as we can see for this one, what we're doing is we're pulling in the Docker image, we're running a Docker Compose build, and we can see actually that Docker Compose logs running down here below. And like I said before, this is really trying to get to that point where it's ready to code, right? So you've simply been to that repository, you've pressed a button, there you go, there's your editor, you're up and ready to code. Now, if I hop over to my desktop as well, now we can see it's doing the same thing, just installing and running a few checks here for my workspace on my desktop as well. And you've got VS Code here that's running on your desktop. So you could use either integration. If you like coding in a browser, lots of people do. If you want a browser tab, however, it's like the Command W problem almost. That if you've been working on your desktop for so long, you might find that you do Command W to close down tabs, and then that as well can be a bit frustrating for some developers. But that's fine because it's your choice. Choose whichever editor or IDE makes sense for you. We want you to be entirely flexible to doing that. So that's kind of how it is. And here you go. This is literally VS Code in your browser, and that's literally VS Code on your desktop. Once you've got VS Code in your desktop, you can head over to the to the Gitpod plugin, which we pre-install for you as well. And then you could even swap between workspaces. So I could even swap to a different running workspace if I want to swap between tasks if I'm working on them just directly in VS Code. And if I want to, I can go back to my CLI and I can stop those workspaces, delete them, and that kind of thing just directly from my terminal. And yeah, if I want to do, so there's also for folks that don't like to code in VS Code or JetBrains, you can just open directly an SSH connection from your terminal, which again just throws you straight into the workspace and you've got access to everything. Or you can open a terminal running in the browser as well. So tons of options. We really want to make sure that every developer is sort of catered for, because we know that developers have many different needs and different preferences, so we cater for a lot of those. But yeah, that's very much the user side of Gitpod. There's actually quite a lot more to Gitpod behind the scenes and other things you can do with it, but that from a developer experience standpoint, that's pretty much it. And
yes,
design-wise as well, it's very, very intentionally designed to be very similar to what you see today. So it's kind of like all of the power of this cloud and automation, but with the tools that you use today. Try not to, reinvent the wheel there. Use what you're used to, just removing as much of those paper cuts and the heavy lifting as we can.
Yeah, so I think like for the Gitpod CLI is actually the new feature, I think, currently.
Yep.
Oh, got it. That's a very neat feature. I love it because sometimes you really like to have a CLI command and things actually work in the browser. So previously, I think you can actually hash a repository like gitpod./hash /, then actually lean into the Gitpod. And then we have I think a Gitpod extension in a repository. And then you can actually, that's a two-way, or even you can develop in the Gitpod in the cloud. That's free third way, I guess. And now the CLI is a fourth way. I think I show there are more and more ways into it as well. So, but exactly. CLI is really like about it. Also, look, can you draw some points? So, like you tell us about the Gitpod YAML. So might be folks from the developer's point of view. So that Gitpod YAML automatically develop for you based on your repository structure. That Gitpod actually reading it and drawing it. So basically, you don't need to do anything if you are developing in Gitpod.
Yeah. So Gitpod YAML just needs to be at the root of your repository. When you open a new repository in Gitpod, we attempt to make a best guess looking at your files, what might be the configuration that you have. There's a limit to how far that goes. I think in the future, who knows, we might start to utilize some LLMs and AI technology to try and infer as much of that as possible. And then once you've got that YAML in there, we just really encourage teams to just iterate on that. That's your sort of central definition of what it takes to set up this repository. So in many ways, that's kind of like you're getting started on the README, but just in code essentially, right? So rather than saying you need to install these tools, just put that into your script, and then you've got a declarative way to start your developer environment. And yeah, one other thing there as well is, you can put a lot of this stuff into scripts as well. If you want to make them reusable, you want to share them between repositories, you don't have to sort of couple yourself too closely to the YAML spec here necessarily, because it's very lightweight. You're just adding a series of commands, so not too much there in terms of coupling as well, which is useful.
Okay, so basically, like if a developer who has actually write a code in the GitHub repository, so in order to Gitpod work, do they able to write a Gitpod YAML file by themselves, or is it created for them on the fly?
So when you open a new repository, it will infer it. So it will try to essentially create this Gitpod YAML for you, but then you can customize it.
Okay.
Essentially, it kind of, am I still sharing my screen? Can you still
Yes,
see my screen?
absolutely.
Okay,
Yes, I can see it.
if I go in here, let me make that a little bit bigger. So actually within each workspace, we also have this command called GP. And what you can actually do is just run GP init. We do this for you when it's a new repository. We actually do this for you automatically. I'm not going to overwrite in this case, but then what that does is it infers based on your sort of directory. Is this a Go project? Is this a Java project, a Node project? And then we'll construct that Gitpod YAML for you once you start the repository. But once it's created for you, then you can extend it as much as you need in terms of customizing for specific needs as well.
Got it. Now another question I think might be we can actually talk about some advanced use cases as well. Like
Yes, definitely.
sometime you have a, let's say you're working with a Terraform files like Terraform code, infrastructure as a code. And remember, like we spoke about some like in IAC, like you want to pull request, we can spoke about these things. But let's say if you want to templatize the infrastructure and you want to test things up, like you can write a code, is it a working, you want, like you don't want to install git like VS code for the IAC for the platform engineer might be. So are those use cases, like how you see those use cases works with Gitpod?
Yeah, so I mean, Terraform itself, just like any tool, I mean, works with Gitpod. If you want to install the Terraform CLI in your workspace, you can do that as well. Nothing stopping you. In fact, I think so. We actually have this image called workspace full, which is the default. So if you don't specify a base image for the workspace, we will give you essentially, it's like a kitchen sink, right? It's a best guess at all of these different tools that you might want available to you. And I'm pretty sure that actually already has Terraform installed into it. So let me just double check live. Why not? I think Terraform. No, it doesn't. So that was one you'd have to install. Or if you want to, you could swap to a pre-made image. So we have a big community. We have multiple different language images that come with that. Or you could install it yourself, just as you would on your local machine here as well. But then for Terraform, yeah, you're going to get that. If you want to develop that inside your environment, you can do. It depends as well, because you might be, I don't know if you're alluding to this, but you might also wanting to create other pieces of your development environment, right? Because running a project might not mean that everything is necessarily kept inside that environment. You might be connecting to an external database. You might be connecting to some other service externally, and then integrated with that in order to create your development environment. You could do that as well. So that's one other reason as well that we also built out the CLI, is to try and make some of that scripting even easier. So you could theoretically there also create environments and also spin up sort of ephemeral environments in your cloud, let's say a database, seed that database, and then have your environment also ready to go like that as well.
Yes, absolutely. And another use case I'm thinking, like sometime you're developing an API for your backend like for the front end applications. And sometimes you have to, in order to developing an APIs, you need a postman and others, those kind of activities you have to perform and test those set up. And that's a very cumbersome task. Like you have to set it up VS Code. Number one, you have to set it up for Postman and other tooling, and then you develop something and then write a browser, hit a browser, refresh a browser. This is very hectic job for the developers, because I have gone through those scenarios where you actually need 3 different screens, like, oh, I need to test this up. This is already in the browser, Gitpod, and basically you have to switch based terminals. You can split your screen and see the instance feedback that the developers usually need to know for the hot reloading. You change something and you still want to see the result in there. That is another. But for the APIs use case, how do you think how Gitpod solve building APIs use case?
Yeah, so very similar to what you already mentioned. So if you've got a different sort of client, it depends on what it is. If it's like a database client and it can connect up via, let's say, SSH, you can also continue to use that as well connected up to your Gitpod workspace through SSH. But let's say you have sort of a fairly generic sort of HTTP server that's then running inside of your workspace, and you need to test against that. One thing that's interesting, right, is because now your workload is running in the cloud, it's running remotely, is that, if you look at this URL here, basically the ports and everything inside the workspace, you can also make those available if you want, not just so also to your own machine, public on the internet, or if you want to share that with some other person as well. What you can do is you can do that, which is interesting. So let's say, you and I are working in the same company. I'm developing APIs. Hey, Simon, I'll be working on this API. Do you want to, test it out? Do you want to, I'm having some issue here with this specific API. I can give you that URL. You can hit my API running in my workspace. And then we can also then, start to debug through that as well. Let me just show you. I can show you that real quick. Oops. So, for instance, we have this ports view in here. So I think, if I remember correctly, which application I opened up here, I think this just got some, this got a running web application here. And obviously this could be, rather than being a web application, it could be, some sort of JSON API or a JSON response. And you can see up here in the URL, basically what we do is we route the ports through into the domain name there. So you can access those, and that's accessed then anywhere in the world. If you want to share that port, if you go back in here, you can basically make that port public, or share it with someone else if you want, copy that. And then, that's probably very similar if you use like a tunneling type of tool like ngrok or something like that. You can do that, and it's all kind of set up and ready for you to go. You don't have to, spin up another tool to kind of access the API or share it with someone else as well and collaborate on it, which is very cool, which is another perk of cloud development environments as well.
That's a very, very useful feature, to be honest with it. I'm wishing it will be there when I'm back then developing 2, 3, 4 years ago, because I'm really disliking like we have to go to the 5 different terminal to check it out, because sometimes you forget like going to what actually I'm about to testing in Postman, which API, what was the flow. So it's a very neat flow in terms of the developer experience. We spoke about in the platform engineering all the time what developer experience is. I really like about this developer experience. Now, one thing we need to call out, because I think that's a really wonderful feature of Gitpod, is there like, how do we can test the CI/CD pipeline in a Gitpod? Like before deploying something in the production, you catch it up some CI/CD pipeline. One thing we all know, like both of us, the code is in there. Like you don't go anywhere else. Code, you write it up. Now you have a Gitpod YAML file, all the dependencies you need. Now we want to trigger these setups, like these tasks. And I want to test a CI/CD pipeline, how these things work in actual practice. This is some sort of functionality, how we can achieve with Gitpod.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I think, especially what I've shown you now, I think the tendency is to think that, sort of Gitpod on then affects your actual environment or the laptop. So one thing that we hear quite commonly is actually, as you said, is kind of shifting left some of those tests. So we don't have a specific sort of direct integration with specific sort of CI configurations. Of course, if you want to share those configurations, you put that into a bash script that's maybe it's used in your Gitpod YAML, or it's also used in your CI config. You can do that as well. But the interesting thing here is, when I started up that workspace as well, is you get a choice of different sort of size and resources. Now, this is on Gitpod Cloud, which is one of the Gitpod offerings, but we also have a different sort of offering called Dedicated, which is installed in your own cloud account. And with that, we actually offer some very different sort of profiles for your actual workspace. And you can have some very, very large workspaces then. And what we find is a lot of customers then are able to run sort of heavy build or test commands actually from within their workspace itself. So not just using the workspace to directly develop, but then also using those resources also to run some of your testing. Recently I was talking to a customer about this a couple of days ago. They were sort of saying that they use Gitpod quite heavily when they're doing load testing. So they spin up a very large workspace with lots of cores. I could do a lot of threading and run lots of requests to a downstream server. And they use that actually for load testing as well. So rather than need to do that within a pipeline, you can do that directly in your workspace. And the cool thing there is, your developer experience then, we use the CI pipeline is you have to then, you push it, you wait, and then let's say something fails, then you have to go back to your own machine and try and recreate that state, right? You have to try and get back to that point where those tests failed. If you can actually run those tests directly in your workspace, well, then you can have that state, that failure state, exactly where you need to, and then you can just pick up from there. And because we mentioned before, you can have as many workspaces as you want. So running those tests doesn't mean you have to stop your work. Start a new workspace, run those tests in one workspace, start another workspace, continue your work. And if that test takes 20, 30 minutes, who knows, an hour long to run, you just hop back into that other workspace and then check on the progress and then pick up from there. So that's definitely a workflow that we see lots of customers, doing with CDEs. And it's also a space that I'm personally very, very excited about as well, because it really starts to potentially shift left a lot of the stuff that we do today that comes post commit. So I've got a talk actually in March where I'll be talking about how I actually, I have a strong belief as well that this trend towards cloud development environments is going to, I think it's in many ways will change how we develop, right? Because now a lot of the things that we do post commit today, testing, CI pipelines, that kind of thing could be brought left. Like it could be brought directly back into your environment. And the reason that we don't do it on our environment is typically because we don't have the resources or we want to multitask. But now that's possible with a tool like a CDE. So I think the sort of the upcoming things in the industry around that is going to be very interesting indeed. I'm very excited about as well.
Yes, absolutely. 100% agreed. I think that's the one that you just spoke about. Like you can test on different workspaces, plus test things up, plus you need to check on the different infrastructures need. That's where we see cloud instances is on demand, thanks to Kubernetes resiliency, or you can call it universal API. That's the most needed use cases for these days. So you can actually on demand test some setups, and that's a really use case to talk about. So now we can circle back to our communication here. We can spoke about few more things before we wrap up. Now we're moving our focus, like people need a Kubernetes based environment. Like I need to have containers, Docker install on my machine. I want to do, let's say, like I want to deploy my container to a registry. I want to deploy some code into the Kubernetes cluster. So some folks who actually developing on Kubernetes, they wanted to understand how Gitpod actually reduces the cognitive load associated to those manual things.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting you say about sort of reducing cognitive load, because I'll speak to the Kubernetes thing in just a moment. So, but I'll speak to the cognitive load thing for just a brief second. So I think one thing that's interesting here is if you look at sort of the vision or what you can actually achieve by using a cloud development environment, it very much maps, especially in my mind as well, to a lot of the sort of the aspirations that you see coming out of the platform engineering community, and you see like the vision for sort of platform teams. Because if you look at the kind of mantra that sort of platform teams are trying to achieve, Kubernetes and all of the internal developer portals and building their own platforms, what they're trying to do there is really to remove, thoughts, sort of additional cognitive load that the developer has to put in, and that they can ultimately be in this state of ready to code. So I think those two are actually incredibly complementary, and a lot of our customers, in fact, most of our customers really as well also kind of buy into this idea of platform engineering. And I think through sort of standardizing your environment, like we've just talked about with the Gitpod YAML and putting all of that in there as well, what you're essentially doing when you use a tool like CD is, I feel like you're ultimately providing those development environments as a service to developers, right? So here's your environment. It's got everything you need. You just click a button. Everything's there, ready to go. To speak to what you mentioned before, so obviously, like when you're doing your development, you need some sort of place to work, like in that case. So in the case of Gitpod, you're working inside of a Gitpod workspace. What you can then do is you can hook Gitpod up to other different resources. And I think maybe there was some topics to get into later, but you could use basically OpenID Connect is a very popular integration that we have to exchange sort of secrets and credential access within a workspace, and that can then allow you to access to remote resources. So We talked a bit before about within the Terraform example, you can spin up a Gitpod workspace, also spin up your, let's say, your Kubernetes namespace or something like that. And then through OpenID Connect, then you can go and fetch sort of access credentials, say, hey, this workspace is owned by Sime, who's working on this project. Therefore, wonderful. Here's your secret to access that. And all of that can be automated into the environment. So when you press that button to start the workspace, you've got access to those other cloud side resources, if that's a Kubernetes namespace or a database or anything like that as well. And if you want, actually, I can briefly just show you how that looks, because it can sound a little bit abstract. But are you still following my screen? If not, if you open up my terminal, I can actually show you that as well.
Yes, I can see your screen. It's currently visible. I can
Awesome.
see the terminal.
Yeah. Awesome. So bear with me 1 second. I think actually I opened. Let's do it. We're using every type of integration today. Why not? So this is another workspace that we opened before, running, in this case, a terminal, but running in the browser, which is a neat integration. But from within the workspace, I have access to this command called GP, and GP lets you do various different tasks with the workspace itself. So it's sort of an internal command line for the workspace. And we have this command in here called GP IDP. And basically, oops, I need to set a token for that. Apologies. So GP IDP token, and I set audience, and let's say that that's going to be Sime. In fact, no, let's do this as sts.amazon.aws.com, I think is the AWS one. So what this essentially does is your installation for Gitpod then becomes sort of like an identity provider. It could create a JWT token, which can then be exchanged with AWS, Azure, GCP, whichever, and then it can go over to those services and bring you back a temporary access token. And that also then is typically a short-lived access token. So once you start that workspace, you go and do that token exchange, and you'll get a temporary short-lived secret token in your workspace, which is great because, especially for security folks, they really don't want you to have, littering your devices with a whole bunch of long-running access tokens, because if those get leaked, then they could be used to compromise your system. But in this case, you're just going to get one for an hour or 2 hours, or however you configure the expire on that token as well. And then that could be used to access, let's say, to your namespace or to whatever else you need to have access to as well. And if you're using like a central secret store, this works perfectly with that, because then you can have all of your different services compartmentalized, let's say in Vault or AWS Secrets Manager or something like this. And then, that can play really well with your development environments. And the best thing is you can codify all of that, and the developer doesn't even have to know what's happening. So you can take all of that cognitive load about secrets management entirely away, and they've just got the workspace with all the credentials that they need. They don't have to worry too much about how that even happens. It's just magic that's set up for them. And then the security best practice just comes by default, which is cool.
Yes, absolutely. That's a really neat feature. We spoke about developer experience, but that is one of the corner feature of it. They don't need to boil down to the internal details of how the secret management works, how the config management works. So it's just a one command, and it offloaded all the several things from developers. Because previously, what he has to do is go to the AWS console. And might be going to click some button in there, add a secret in there, go into the GitHub repository, create a secret in GitHub, so then GitHub can allow to talk to the AWS. And that's a one command actually that's hide 4 trip route to AWS to GitHub. So that's a unique feature I really like about this stuff as well. So I think we can spoke about integrated development. We can spoke about how things actually already available. You just need to click on a button. We spoke about 4 different ways to install, and I think there's a more ways to it. We spoke about the distant difference instance machine. You can test it out, try it out, because right now you actually have a VPA, HPA in Kubernetes that actually you have to test things out. Like if my command is actually going to that CPU mode, how much you can test those things. Now we spoke about how you can integrate with AWS, but there are some things still left and still use cases in there. And I can definitely want you to call out what are the most liked feature of the customers today on the GitHub, And some of the newest pattern I think you will be seeing while talking your customers and the community around how actually they are extending some, adding more and more use cases into the GitHub. So now is your call to tell us about how some extensibility actually evolved over the years.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it depends really on the customer a lot of the time. So one thing the principal sort of reason that a lot of companies use Gitpod is really for developer velocity. You ultimately want to achieve more with less. You want your developers to move faster, to waste less time. So that's one of the principal reasons that developers come to Gitpod. They're like we just saw with some of the secrets management integration. There's also a lot of security benefits to that as well, and then lots of other integrations like integrating with your sort of internal platform and achieving some of your other platform ambitions as well. But all of that I feel like is in service of this ultimate goal, which is like developer velocity, because the whole platform, developer experience movements, all of this is in service of your business, right? It's actually trying to get things done for your business so that your business can be successful, and that's actually everything that we do within development really is in service of that goal. So it does depend a little bit on that, but I think a lot of the things that we talked about today are the typical kind of features that we hear from customers or community that they kind of like, which is sort of this one-click developer environments from pull requests, this ability to automate the secrets management side of it as well. I think there's I often see for users there's two stages of understanding and learning about CDEs, and the first bit is removing like kind of paper cuts from your current workflows, so you don't have to install tools anymore. You don't have to run an installation on your machine. Like once you configure your installation inside your Gitpod YAML, you might never need to touch npm ever again, this kind of thing. But then once you get into this cloud development environment, I think there's a whole bunch of other additional features that you don't realize. So we talked a little bit about this. You can start to multi-track. You can multitask on different workspaces at the same time. You can share your running workspace with other people whilst you're coding and debugging. You can, like we saw with the ports, you can share like an API with someone else. You can hand this over to different people like quality assurance, and they can come in and review your application. So there's also these sort of additional benefits, I think, once you make the switch, that you kind of realize that, oh, wait, hold on. If we start working in this way, but you unlock all of these other sort of developer experience benefits as well. And I think those are some of the things that I think certainly for a lot of users and customers, those are the things that they get really excited about, is this new sort of frontier, these new opportunities that then become unlocked once you start developing in the sort of new CDE type way.
Yes, absolutely. And I think if you can see from the different angle, is like one of the angle you can see from the Gitpod is like, let's say you're doing a demonstration of some of the language. Like if you want to teach React to your community or your student, what do you have to do? You ask your developers or anyone who is attending your talk, install VS Code, install this library, install this and that. So 15, 20 minutes of time you're spending on your workshop configuring the tooling so you can actually deliver your talk in a proficient manner. Now the Gitpod is there, saving 20 minutes of your time. So you can spend more time that you have in an hour to speak about the technology and how it's useful for you, not hustling with the tooling. Also, if you're doing a freelancing setup, you want to test your things for your customers on the fly, like I doing this type of things. So the Gitpod is already available. But if you're a teacher or a DevOps teacher in your university local, now the Gitpod is there for you. You can actually test and try things out. Anybody who has a network access to it can deploy it instantly, and they can replicate the stuff you're actually doing on your machine. So that way, I think the learning become more effective and the questionnaires become more effective. So those are other use cases of the Gitpod as well. But there are more other, like if you're going into the KubeCon and want to do a demo, like that's a hustle for previously. Like, oh, I don't want to demo because there's a 5 other things I have to do done before demo this stuff. Do a demo of Kubernetes or any new features that you like about or any language. Do a demo on there or any case study event. Those are the very important use cases for the community. I think that's I see more and more people starting a shift toward GitHub because of this one-click installer for a bunch of
Hmm.
those things that's become a hurdle for them in the past. They can't do it, but now they can do it. So I think that's another use case you can spoke about as well, because that's one of the podcasts I did earlier in the last year around vCluster on Kubernetes
Mm.
vCluster how it gets set up. I spoke about like we have use case area for the we can use it for the teaching purposes, and that is same true for the Gitpod. Like we as a demonstrator or the technology evangelist actually sometime constrained by the network bandwidth or sometime constrained by the time bandwidth. So that's where the Gitpod is a friend for you. So before we wrapping up your podcast, we are actually 2 weeks away from the new year. I think particularly most probably 15, 16 days. I believe there's a more in the horizon in the Gitpod. Some tough stuff you want to keep it secret, but some stuff we'd wanted to know ahead of time. So be mentally prepared. So what's new feature for the 2024 coming up?
No, it's a great question. So there is some really big things that we have coming, which I can't share total details about just yet, but I can allude a little bit to some of that. So certainly one thing that we know is really, really important, and you've seen, I did a little quick demo of the CLI there, is integrations. Like this is a big thing for Gitpod, in terms of integrating into other services, making it easier for other people to integrate into Gitpod, integrating Gitpod into your developer platform, into your portal if you have that as well. Wherever you need, like if you know, the CLI, we have customers, you know, want to bundle that CLI inside of their own internal CLI, and this kind of thing. So integrations is a big piece that will be sort of doubling down, and I'm sure next year there'll be some big changes there around that. The other area as well is we just want to bring Gitpod to more and more developers. So can't share too much information on how we're going to do this, but we're really trying to on this journey really to bring developers, you know, to anyone who is a developer around the world to use Gitpod. This last year we've been working on this other offering called Gitpod Dedicated. That's been amazing because what that allowed us to do is to take what we had in Gitpod Cloud, and we had lots of security conscious companies who are like, great, yeah, I've used it, I use it myself personally, can I take it to my company? But I just can't use your, you know, so I can't use SaaS, I can't use multi-tenant, or, you know, I'm behind a firewall. So we have this product called Gitpod Dedicated, which is literally Gitpod itself, but it's shifted inside of your cloud account. And we're going to take this whole thinking even further as well. Beyond that, can't share any details, but it will make it so that ultimately that this type of tooling can be used by even more sort of customers and developers, because ultimately the vision, the idea here is to try and make this as available to anyone that could possibly benefit from it, which is in essence is really any developer. We really want starting and working on a project for you to be able to just do that within Gitpod. You know, that's something that comes to your mind. You're like, right, I've got an idea, whether that's a new project, an open source project, anything, personal, private, company, doesn't matter. Kubernetes, data, Python, Terraform, whatever, that you can then do it in Gitpod. So that's really integrations and ubiquitous, almost like trying to get Gitpod into more hands is really the big plans for
Yes.
2024.
Absolutely. And before we're leaving off today, I think if somebody watched the demos of the Gitpod, one thing they don't want to do afterward is because they like about the feature and they want to learn more and more about it. So since his keen is sharing, so is there some of the resources you can share with some of the folks or some of the places they can go to and learn about more stuff in there?
Yeah, for sure. So I mean, if you just go to Gitpod.io, you can find some more stuff in there. If you go to the docs, you can go ahead and have a read about Gitpod. But the nice thing here is Gitpod Cloud is free for 50 hours. So you can use it for 50 hours a month. Anyone without paying a penny, basically, then you can get have a play around with CDEs, if you want to use that for your own projects or for your work stuff, you can do. If you want to take that to your team, you can do. All you have to do is basically go over to Gitpod.io, go down here, try for free, log in with your SCM provider, GitHub, GitLab, that kind of thing, and then you're in. And then that's it. Just start creating workspaces like I just did. We did today, and start exploring. And I'd probably say that's the best way, right? As a developer, you just want to try the tool. You just want to log in, see how it works, poke around, hack around, use it for your own project. So I'd probably suggest that. Go grab one of your repositories on GitHub, something like that. Go to your URL, stick in gitpod.io /hash, paste your repository. In fact, let's do it just now. So if we just go over here, gitpod.io /hash, and your repo, press enter, you're in. Press OK, your workspace is spinning up. But that's all it takes to try it. So yeah, you don't really have a reason not to. Go and have a play around. And then just have a think about where it might be of benefit to you.
Absolutely. I think that's the best thing for the developers of 2023. I love those functionality exist on my time, and even Lou in your time as well, because that is one of the wishes for mine in the past. Like, I've been hacking around all of the different tooling. This is one of those tool that is actually a click of a button away from you to test it out. It's only a one click, exactly, and you can test it out. That's a super team behind the work is there. And if the Lou is working on this project, you can expect more and more great things from this guy. He's been wonderful in explaining some wonderful complex topic. And we've been keep chatting, I think, for a year long now in some of the different places, even the CNCF platform working group, and also on the platform engineering challenge. It's been a wonderful 1 year and 2 podcasts with you, Lou, on the last quarter of the year. Has been great collaboration going on. We take it more further as the more progress happening in the Gitpod. I will invite you again to speak about this stuff. So final words is about your personal some consideration for the 2024. You've been busy in the platform engineering stuff, and I think tomorrow you're presenting on a webinar on Gitpod. Gitpod means not the tooling, but Gitpod is the company's webinar around the platform engineering. Talk us about that, and I will share the link in the YouTube description so people can join in.
Yeah, for sure. So that's on next Tuesday. It's basically we'll be running a lot more of these. So that one is an introduction to platform engineering tooling. I think you can think of it kind of like the ThoughtWorks kind of tech radar. So if you're in a platform team thinking about starting one and curious about the sort of tooling landscape and different tools that you might want to keep an eye on, basically be running through those in a webinar next Tuesday. If you can share the link in the notes for people, that would be awesome. And then if you keep an eye on Gitpod on social, we're always posting these kinds of things. Check out the blog, and hopefully we'll be running lots of webinars also in the new year, talking about CDEs and developer experience and platform engineering, that kind of thing. That's very much what we're always talking about. So.
Yes, absolutely. I definitely share the link with the webinar, and also I do join myself as well. I want to learn more things about platform engineering, and Lou's vision is wonderfully well. And we spoke about platform engineering on this channel, and we spoke about developer experience in general and why developer experience is important right now on this channel. And Lou did some wonderful observation. And those observation is reflected on the hands-on experience of Gitpod. And you're thinking why Gitpod is actually a one-click button installer, because the thinking behind is that a developer experience from the ground up. So you can definitely listen to that podcast as well, and then go back here and see how Gitpod actually reducing some cognitive load. That's the cognitive load we every time speak about in the platform engineering community, so that you need to know as well. So once again, Lou, another 1 hour, 2 hours of 2023 with you is pleasures of mine, spending and learning stuff from you. And we will keep on doing more and more, and wishing you a best of 2024 and a happy year in advance. And we'll be speaking again next year, most probably on the same channel and some other stuff. So thank you very much. You listen to this podcast, share your comment in the description, and grab a link for the Lou Bichard webinar that is doing on the next week around platform engineering. So stay safe, stay healthy, have a wonderful day, and we'll be meeting again soon. Bye bye, everyone.